All right, hello everyone. We're going to start chapter 15, which is going to start our unit on evolution. So this is going to be our unit 7, kind of start of our lectures, and this is really going to focus on Darwin and evolution. So I usually play this video. I'm not going to play it for you here, obviously. It's just like a nice little kind of introduction to evolution, and just thinking about learning about science. So just before we get into this section, there's a lot of stuff here that you really don't need to memorize, but I just like to take you through it. Just kind of the history of evolutionary thought, because it wasn't that Darwin was the first. He was just the most correct. So Plato, this is again thousands of years ago. Plato proposed that all species are perfect in their current form, which means they're unchanging, and people thought this for a long period of time. Aristotle observed species that could be arranged in increasing complexity. So you can see how he arranged them. You can see plants, animals, humans, seeing that there was obviously differences. They are categorizing the species they see in a certain way. You can see here the classification system: non-living, then plants, animals, and human beings be at the top. And that's kind of just a kind of an old way of thinking of species and humans, kind of like humans being the top pinnacle of all species, and it's just not true. It's not true. We're just one of the species that lives on Earth. Taxonomy. This is the science of classifying organisms. We're going to get more into taxonomy when we get into the later chapters here in Unit 7. But basically, we're seeing the beginnings of organizing species with Plato and Aristotle from thousands of years ago. We're also going to talk about Carlos Linnaeus here just a little bit. He's the founder of modern taxonomy. He developed the system of classifying species into two, the two name naming system, but called binomial nomenclature. But the crazy thing is that Linnaeus actually didn't accept that species evolved. He thought that species were fixed, which means they're unchanging. And so it's kind of funny that we classify species in the evolutionary way, using his system, and he didn't accept evolution or that species changed. And you might going back to your Carlos Linnaeus, he was around. If I'm remembering my dates correctly, he was around or just a little bit before Darwin. And you might think, well, how did he know about species changing? Well, again, it's not that Darwin was the first, because there were many people that thought that species changed. But again, the reason why we give Darwin the kind of the crown of the founder of evolution is because he was the most correct. So there were other scientists that were looking at how species change, and George's Louis Leclerc. I always it's trouble. I have trouble pronouncing his name, but Leclerc was one of the kind of the founders of not say founders, but one of the initial scientists that really started to talk about how species change, and he challenged this idea that life was unchanging, and he proposed that the species change due to environmental factors. Now, he still believed in special creation and speculated that the Earth was just was on all species were created, but um, he did start to speculate the Earth was more than just 6,000 years old. Um, Darwin said, you can see here, the first author who in modern times has treated evolutionary scientific spirit was Leclerc. So he gave a lot of kind of just like props to Leclerc. Now, Erasmus Darwin, you might think, hey, I misspelled Charles Darwin. No, Erasmus Darwin was actually Darwin's grandfather. He was a physician and a naturalist. Now, we don't use the term naturalist a lot in science today because it's kind of an older term, but basically he was a biologist, and he made observations that species might change and their organs and their structures might change. And what we see is that these species change over time. Now, I love giving this quote from Erasmus Darwin. He was again Darwin's grandfather. Says the final course of this contest among males seems to be the strong and most active males should propagate the species and would thus be improved. What does that sound like to you? That sounds like natural selection. Yeah, and again, Erasmus Darwin had some of the kind of framework for species changing, but again, we don't give him the crown because he wasn't the most correct. He had some ideas that kind of flowed with evolutionary thought, but just not where Darwin was. Cuvier was a one of my favorite scientists to talk about here. He's the kind of the founder of paleontology. Again, these not everyone accepted evolution at this time, or that species change, and he actually opposed it. He supports something called catastrophism, which we're going to talk about, and he proposed something called extinction. We all know about extinction. We all know that extinction occurs. We all know that species go extinct. But again, at this time, even scientists thought that species would never die out. That species that are here today have always been here, and this ideology really had to be kind of a shift in ideology had to happen before Darwin understood evolutionary thought. Now, Cuvier discovered and kind of talked about something called catastrophism, where major events are responsible for physical changes of Earth. So, like earthquakes, volcanoes, floods. This is what causes the Earth to have its physical features, which sometimes is true. But it wasn't until James Hutton and Charles Lyell come around and kind of found this thing called uniformitarianism. I know it's a big word, but uniformitarianism is the ideology that the Earth's features are due to slow processes like erosion, sedimentation, rocks forming over millions of years. And it wasn't until these two individuals that we see that science and people start understanding the Earth is more than a couple thousand years old. It's millions of years old. Um, there's a couple of videos I like to show. I'm not going to show them here, but again, you can see these layers in the earth. Oh, this just makes me so happy seeing these layers in the earth. These layers are formed over millions of years, not thousands of years. And that ideology really had to take kind of hold of Darwin before he could come up with his theory of evolution. So gradual changes are responsible to Earth's physical features. And yes, and you can have sometimes where there is a catastrophe. Yes, there is maybe an earthquake that changes things, but it's not all things. It's usually more the slow, uniform, continuous things. And it wasn't until modern day where we understand the universe is 13.8 billion years old, the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and life on Earth is almost as old as Earth. It's about 3.8 billion years old. And one more scientist that we want to cover before we get into Darwin, and his name is Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck, and you can kind of tell he's French. And he was the first biologist to really offer a testable explanation for how species change. And Darwin actually wrote that Lamarck's understanding really kind of gave him his understanding of evolution. Now, he was correct in a lot of different ways. He understands that more complex organisms come from less complex organisms. Adaptations are the driving force of evolution. So, like the long neck in giraffes, and this is kind of his understanding. And the characteristics and that characteristics are inherited from parent to offspring. Remember, we're in the 1800s. We don't know about genetics. We really don't. I mean, we know about cells, but we don't know how genetics are passed on. The way that he was incorrect is that he thought that organisms could pass on acquired characteristics. This is the idea of use and disuse, where you can see this giraffe elongating its neck after every generation and passing on that acquired characteristics. So this would be like if you have like your arm cut off, then you would have a kid without an arm. And this obviously doesn't happen, but this is kind of what Lamarck thought, where if an organism used an appendage more or something more, they would be passed on from the next generation, and would again use and disuse. Our last guy that I'm going to talk about here is Thomas Malthus. He was an economist, and if you're taking like an AP economy class, you might read about Malthus and his understanding of like population sizes and driving forces of resources. But what basically I'm sorry, not Erasmus Darwin, Thomas Malthus talked about was there are too many organisms in an area with not enough resources. And what that's going to lead to is competition among those organisms, and some of those organisms surviving and some of those organisms dying out. And he wrote a book about this with human populations that Darwin read that really started to help him understand how species are going to evolve. Some are going to die, some are going to live, and that's going to be the driving force of evolutionary thought. This is a pretty easy graph to kind of understand. You can see the population growing. At a certain point, it's going to go over the food production, and there's going to be war and famine, and then that population is going to decrease because obviously there's going to be competition among the species. Now, what do you got to know from this? There's a lot that you don't have to know. I would know about Lamarck. I would know that there are other scientists at the time talking about evolutionary thought and how species change. And basically, the Earth is very old, how old the Earth is. So this is the end of 15.1. All right, the next section is going to be on Charles Darwin, and again, there's a lot here on that on a black background that you don't have to write down. But Darwin was born in 1809, and he was actually born to a pretty wealthy family. His dad was a physician, his grandfather was a physician or doctor, and so they were kind of well off. And but he was very interested in nature from a very young age. Now, Darwin really is kind of like the poster child for if you fail at something once or twice, that you can still make it in life. Because he sent to medical school to become a doctor, but he actually hated it. He actually hated the sight of blood. Actually, there's a story about him watching in a surgery from of a kid. A kid was having a surgery done. And remember, this is the early 1800s. They don't have anesthetics. They don't have like things to help with the pain. And the kid was screaming, and that was like the moment he was like, "Nope, this isn't for me. I can't do this. I can't stand the sight of blood. I can't make people feel like this. Like this is just not for me." So then he went back, and Darwin was kind of just not working and not really didn't have a goal in life. And so his dad sent him to be a clergyman. He did eventually make it through the clergyman kind of classes, but he really didn't. He really didn't he didn't obviously become a clergyman, but he loved his science classes, and he worked with a botanist called John Henslow. And this is where he really started to find his love of kind of like identifying plants and animals and species, and just got a better understanding of how to do so. He also worked with a professor by the name of Adam Sedgwick, who is kind of the founder of modern geology. And this is where he started to understand deep time. So both of these people really started to kind of shape his understanding of how we classify things in science and how the Earth is millions to billions of years old. Now, I always like to kind of point out here that everyone thinks of Darwin as a biologist, but he's actually more of a geologist. If you read his book on evolution, most of it is actually about geology and deep time. So he is a biologist, and everyone thinks of him this way, but he is more of like if Darwin was alive today, he'd be like, "No, I'm not a biologist. I'm a geologist." So he is much more in the understanding of more of deep time. Now, these pictures aren't showing up as well as I want them to, but this is the boat that he traveled on. Oh, I'm sorry. Before we get to the boat, so he after kind of like not really, doing the clergyman thing, he went on a voyage to map out the coastline of South America. And this voyage was supposed to take 2 years initially, but it ended up taking 5 years in all. Now, let me go back. This is the HMS Beagle. It was captained by Captain Fitzroy. And at this time, the captain was not allowed to kind of socialize with the workers. So Darwin didn't go on the boat as a naturalist. Everyone think he was supposed to go as like a scientist, but he wasn't. He was actually just a companion to the captain. Whenever like the captain would have dinner, he couldn't have dinner with his crewmates, and he wanted somebody. What usually did was they brought somebody along, and so they agreed to bring Darwin on and be his companion. And actually, there's note that Captain Fitzroy and Darwin actually had some pretty fierce arguments because the captain really didn't accept that species change, and he was just against that idea. And they had some arguments and had to kind of just like work through that as the time went on. But when Darwin reached the Argentina coast, he actually went up to the mountains, and because they would set sail there or go to a port and kind of be there for a while. And what he did was he went up to like the like some of the top of the mountains in the Andes, and he found shells at the top of these mountains, which didn't make sense to him. If these locations were at the very top of these mountains, how could there be shells? The life that you would see in the oceans. Like, how would there be life there? So one of the things he started to realize was the tops of the mountains were actually the bottoms of the oceans from millions of years ago. So this helped him understand deep time. Um, Whenever he was on the boat, he also saw the coastline and these layers of earth. Again, every time I see these layers, I just get really happy because this shows us deep time. And again, this was more evidence that he kind of started to understand that the earth was millions and millions of years old, not just a couple thousand. So Darwin's voyage eventually led to the Galapagos Islands. Knows that these are very famous islands off the coast of Ecuador. They are actually Ecuadorian, so it means they belong to the country of Ecuador, about 600 miles off the coast. Now, these are a set of volcanic islands, and these islands arose at different time periods. You can see how many millions of years ago each set of islands arose. Let me show you why. So these islands are off the coast of Ecuador, and they have just like kind of different variations in their biography or biogeography, where the current different currents in the different tectonic plates have created these little zones where the volcanoes will create different islands at just different time periods when there's more volcanic activity. So what this does is it really creates a kind of an ecosystem on each island that's very different. It's almost like a setup experiment for evolution. And one of the species you can see here, this is me back in 2018. I went to the Galapagos Islands. These are the Galapagos tortoises, and these are some tortoises that are native to the islands there. You can see how each island has a different kind of shell, different kind of look, different kind of just overall appearance. And Darwin noticed this when he was going from island to island. And actually, the inhabitants of the Galapagos could say, I can actually tell you which tortoise comes from which island. Now, regrettably, the sometimes the Galapagos tortoises were taken from the islands because they were a good source of meat on the boats. They would actually like keep them around for a couple of weeks and then kill them and eat them because they were a good source of protein while they were out on the boats. But whenever the natives of the islands saw each tortoise shell, they could say, "Hey, that one's from this island." So Darwin started to think about like why would there be so many different types of these tortoises and so many different types of these shells? Like, why wasn't there just one type of shell for all the islands? He also saw this in his famous finches, and these finches were the or each island had a different finch species that was really dominant on that island, and he didn't understand why are we seeing all these different types of finches. Each island seems to have a different variation of a very close ancestor to the finches that he saw on the coast. Now, um, one thing to understand here is that Darwin didn't understand evolution as soon as he saw this. It's not like he, understood this and wrote on his way back to this voyage and everything figured out. But what he did see was these each of these islands had a different bird that adapted or had an adaptation for a different type of food source. So one thing we want to note here is there are two sources of genetic variation within a population, and the first is mutations, and the second is meiosis. So we see variations within a population because of these two reasons. Darwin didn't know this, but Darwin did see adaptations, and these are inherited characteristics that are going to improve an organism's ability to survive and reproduce. And what he was seeing on the islands was that the finches on each island were adapting to a particular food source. You can see insect eating woodpeckers, seed eating. These are different types of the same variation of the ancestral finch, and these adaptations were leading to these species to look different on each island. One more note here, fitness. I'm going to use this term a lot in the next few days to weeks. Fitness, not the fitness that you're thinking of with how strong somebody is, but this describes how successful an organism is at living and reproducing. You can see the lower fitness bird here only has two offspring. The higher fitness bird has more offspring. So to have a high fitness, you have to both survive and reproduce more. Lower fitness, you're not surviving as much, you're not reproducing as much. So when we talk about fitness, we're talking about living and reproducing. Now, Darwin again didn't understand evolution instantly. It's not like he's like, poof, I understand it. I'm going to write about it. He took more than 20 years after he got back from his voyage to really start, investigating and corresponding and really start to understand evolution at a deeper level. So it's not like he instantly understood. He took years to really research this, and partly because he was a little bit scared of how the not only the government but kind of the religious like community would take his understanding of evolution because this was going to go against the church. This was going to go against the church's teaching. So Darwin was not only waiting to gather evidence, but he was a little bit nervous about how he would be perceived by just kind of like religion as a whole. So part of the reason he didn't publish at first was he was a little bit nervous, and he wanted to get as much evidence as he could and really produce something that could withstand the test of time. So Darwin again didn't understand natural selection instantly, and one thing that he started to work on, or kind of start to wrap his head around, was something called artificial selection. And I kind of like starting with this a little bit before natural selection because it's a little bit easier to understand and kind of get a grasp of. But humans are going to or control which organisms reproduce in a population, and in this case, they're going to increase the frequency of desired traits. So we have again variation in a population. This is due to meiosis. This is due to mutations. What is going to happen is farmers are going to select for like a type of, or like you can see the this group of whatever organism this is, and they're going to have them reproduce in the next population. You can see the next population, they're a little bit taller than this population. In the next population here, the farmer is going to only select the tallest again. So what this does is it increases the frequency of the farmer's crops to be bigger and have larger yields. And obviously, this is good for people back then because food scarcity was, or food, availability was a big problem. And we see a lot of different, now you can see the two images here, but dogs are an example of this. Pigeons were an example of this. uh, I need to get this pigeons. Look at this pigeons. This thing is in the way. Cats are an example of this. Cows are an example of this. Chickens, wild pigs, corn is an example of this. The All these different types of vegetables are an example of this. So artificial selection has really. I like showing that picture of the watermelon, what it looked like in the 1600s and what it looks like now. But artificial selection is how we have
Darwin.
so much different variations and kind of food production in our agricultural business today. Now, another reason why Darwin kind of, I don't say rushed, but so he waited 20 years and then published. But why he really published was he was corresponding with another naturalist whose name was Alfred Russel Wallace, and Alfred Russel Wallace was he was not he was on a voyage. He was observing some of the same things that Darwin observed, but in a different location. It's called the Malay Archipelago. And what he did was he was looking at how species were um, different in these islands that were, there was maybe some reasons behind it. And so he kind of quickly jotted down his manuscript about natural selection. I always like showing this meme. And when Darwin got it, he actually was like, "Oh crap, this guy is onto my theory." So, what Darwin had written out was the same as look, not not Leclerc, as Alfred Russel Wallace was again natural selection. Organisms exhibit variation between generations. This is due to mutations and meiosis. Organisms are going to compete for limited resources. Individuals within a population differ in terms of their reproductive success. Species become more adapted to their environment and its changes. So, what happens is over time, there's going to be competition for resources. Not every organism is going to get the same amount of resources. That means after the next generation, there is going to be a difference in the second generation compared to the first. And that is basically natural selection. So, what Darwin did was he published his work on November 24th of 1859. On his book was called "On the Origins of Species by Natural Selection," and you'd think that there would be a competition between Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin, but they actually became lifelong friends. Um, uh, Alfred Russel Wallace actually called his book that he wrote Darwinism because he understood that Darwin really came up with the concept of evolution, and he gave Darwin all the credit because he has so much evidence. He had so much time behind working on his theory. It wasn't just like, hey, I have this quick manuscript. I'm going to try to take credit for this. They worked together on it in the end. So this is actually, we're going to end 15.2. I know it's a long section, but this is the end of 15.2. Our last section of chapter 15 is going to be on the evidence of evolution. And this is where I really get, just excited about because it's dealing with fossils. And, I'm big on fossils and paleontology. But when we remember evidence of evolution, we have to remember the word FAME. It stands for fossils, anatomical, molecular, and embryological. And each one of these types of evidence is going to have a couple different parts to it. So let's get into the F for fossils. So fossils are remains of once living organisms, and less than 1% of a species will become fossilized. And this is because it takes a particular environment and specialized things to happen. And even though only a less than 8% becomes fossilized, there is still an extensive fossil record that supports evolution. One thing to know about the fossil record is something called the law of superposition. This is where older life on Earth is found deeper in the Earth, while younger life is found up near the top. This is kind of something you probably already understand, but one thing to understand about the complexity within the fossil record here is that the fossils become increasingly complex as we get closer to the top. So in the beginning, they were very simple, and each layer you can see is going to add on complexity. And this is again, this image right here is always seen when we talk about this complexity increasing when talking about fossils. You can see again millions of years. We did an activity with this, but there are millions of years worth of fossil records that we're going to look at just in general for our fossil record. But yeah, this is for F for fossils. Now, under fossils, we have something called transitional fossils, and I kind of don't like this term, but I think it's important for students to kind of know because these are the intermediate forms between one kind of big transition in life. So we're going to talk about tiktaalik a little bit, how we went from water to land, how Archaeopteryx is kind of like a transitional fossil between like the dinosaurs that lived on the ground and then the birds that fly birds that fly in the sky. The reason I don't like this word is because everything is a transitional fossil. Everything can be looked at as a transition between one thing and the next. But if you ever hear this term, this is just like a kind of a really a significant change in a life form and how it goes about that. Yeah, that's every fossil is a transitional fossil. There are going to be a couple videos I watch about this, but there's a misunderstanding here that these transitional fossils, like there's not enough of them, and there's actually a kind of a like a fault. I don't know if the fault's the right words here, but there is something that happens when we talk about these transitional fossils. Somebody might say, "Oh, there's not a transitional fossil between A and Z." Then we find that transitional fossil, it's B. Now there's two gaps, and we find that transitional fossil between A and B, and it's C, and then we find another one. So you can see there's just an increasingly, every time we find a transitional fossil, there's essentially another transitional fossil that we need to find. So there's never going to be a complete record of every single organism from the first to the last, but we see an extensive amount of these transitional fossils between species. And the fossil record, again, is incomplete, but there is just a ton of fossil record out there. I'm going to show a couple good videos about the transitional fossils and things like that. Anatomical. So now we're getting to the A's. So anatomical. This is homologous structures. These are structures that are atomically similar because they are inherited from a common ancestor. You can see all of these species share this one bone, two bone, many bone feature because they all evolved from Tiktaalik having that one bone, two bone, many bone. But each of these species sees a difference in the how they use them. So they all evolved obviously over millions of years to have a different kind of structure and function for each of these species. It's again because they all evolved from a recent common ancestor of the ancient lobe-finned fish. Like the hands of all primates look very similar because we all inherit them from a recent common ancestor millions of years ago. And even us and like chimpanzees have the fingerprints that you can see here because again we share a recent common ancestor. Analogous structures, these are a little bit different. They're actually kind of the opposite. They are when they have the same function but different structures. So like the flying birds, the flying pterosaurs, and flying bats, they've all evolved the same function, but obviously from different structures. Like the structure here is not homologous with the structure here and here. They've evolved different ways to fly. So these are called analogous structures. More examples of analogous structures are like the legs of ants and the legs of horses. They have the same function, different structures. Fish fins and dolphin flippers, same function. They propel them in the water, different structure. Same with the bird wings that we talked about and the insect wings, same function, different structure. Within the anatomical, we also have vestigial organs or vestigial structures. These are leftover remnants of organs or features like bones that are still there because they evolved millions of years ago, but now the organism doesn't have a use for them. So, like the leg bones in or not spiders in snakes, they don't obviously have legs, but they still have kind of like hip and joint bones from the when they did have them millions of years ago. We have a tailbone because we used to have a tail millions of years ago. Now we don't have a tail. We don't have a reason to for that tailbone, but it's still there. Actually, the hip bones in whales, they used to live on land. Now they don't, but they still have that vestigial pelvic bone. And this is because, again, they evolved to live in water millions of years ago. I'm going to kind of go through these. Yep, 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 yep. All right, we're going to stop right there for just a second. The last 2 points of evidence are molecular, that we're going to go over first. But this is where various amounts of DNA is going to be identical between species. And this is going to show how closely two species are going to be related to each other. So you can see here the different species and how many nucleotides they have different are going to show us how close two species are. So I always like to compare DNA with a human, and so like we as a human share 7% with our DNA with a bacteria, which shows that we're not really closely related to bacteria. We share 50% of that DNA of our DNA with a banana. You wouldn't think a banana and us have a lot in common, but we actually do. 60% with a fruit fly, 6% with chickens, 70% with sea sponges, 80% with mice. As we get into these more mammalian creatures, we're going to see a higher amount, 82% with dogs, 90% with cats, 96% with gorillas, 98% with chimpanzees. We share 98% of our DNA with a chimpanzee. You are 99.9% identical to the person next to you because you are so closely related to each other. And we see this in all aspects of life, not just humans. We see this in every aspect of life. I was like showing everyone these different karyotypes. The one big difference here is you can see the second and third chromosome in each one of these species is fused for humans. And this is because we have 46 chromosomes in our karyotype, but chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans actually have 48. It's because their second and third chromosome is fused together in ours. And how do we know that? It's because we find actually two sets of these telomeres that we talked about before in our second chromosome. So we can actually see when that fused millions of years ago. Our last piece of evidence is embryological evidence, and this is how the development of the embryo kind of I don't say evolves, but kind of is develops differently in the womb. But we can see similarities between each one of these organisms. You can see the fish, salamander, tortoise, chicken, and human, how closely related we are because of how close our embryological development is. This area of biology is really tough to really. I'm going to go back to that last slide. It's really tough to kind of explain, but there's a huge amount of research in the embryological differences as an embryo really develops here. And this is would be a really cool if you want to look into some kind of just more information. This is a really cool area. But this is going to end chapter 15 for us.